Imagine standing on a vast plain under a sky so clear and so infinite that it feels like the heavens themselves are pressing down upon you. The earth around you stretches endlessly in all directions, flat, golden, ancient. The sun beats down with a steady, relentless warmth, and the air carries the smell of brick dust, sweat, and something else, something almost sacred, as if you've stumbled into a moment that will echo through all of human history. Around you, thousands of voices rise and fall in perfect harmony, speaking words you understand completely, a single language flowing like water between every mouth on earth, and towering above it all, impossibly tall, reaching upward with an ambition so fierce it seems to challenge the very laws of nature, stands a structure of brick and tar that grows taller every single day. This is the story of Babel. This is the story of a moment when all of humanity was one, when they all spoke the same tongue, when they all dreamed the same dream, and when that dream was shattered in an instant by forces beyond their comprehension or control. The biblical account comes to us from the book of Genesis, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. It's a short passage, deceptively simple, but like so many ancient texts, its brevity conceals depths that scholars and theologians have spent millennia trying to unfold. The story opens with a statement so fundamental it almost passes unnoticed, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Think about that for a moment. Not most of the earth. Not many nations speaking different tongues with some translation occurring between them. The whole earth. Every human being who had ever lived at that point, every civilization, every settlement, every wandering tribe, all of them spoke the same words, understood each other instantly, shared concepts and ideas without the friction of linguistic barriers. This is the world in which our story takes place, a world so different from our own that it's almost impossible for us to truly imagine it. As the text continues, we learn that the people of this unified world journeyed eastward from their origins. Some scholars place this in the region of Mesopotamia, others in the Fertile Crescent, but the text itself points us toward a specific location, the land of Shinar. The name Shinar carries weight in biblical geography. It's referenced throughout Scripture as a place of significance, a region of ancient power and importance. And in this land, the people found what they were looking for, a plain, and they said one to another, "Go to, let." And they said one to another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. The text is almost mundane in its detail. Brick, mortar, the basic materials of construction. But this is precisely what makes it so powerful. The people weren't dreamers lost in abstract speculation. They were builders, craftspeople, people who understood materials and labour and the slow accumulation of effort that transforms vision into reality. What did those bricks feel like in their hands? Heavy, still warm from the kiln, rough textured against calloused palms. What did the mortar smell like? Acrid, sharp, the smell of tar and binding agents mixed together, the smell that would cling to their clothes and hair and skin. What did the work sound like? The rhythmic thud of bricks being laid, the scrape of trowels spreading mortar, the voices of workers calling out to each other in perfect understanding, coordinating their efforts without confusion or misunderstanding. Every person knew exactly what every other person was trying to accomplish. There were no language barriers slowing the work, no need for translation or clarification, just perfect, fluid communication and the steady, methodical construction of something unprecedented. And what were they building? The text gives us the purpose in one crucial sentence, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. There it is. The ambition laid bare. They wanted to make a name for themselves. In the ancient world, a name wasn't merely an identifier. It was a claim to permanence, to significance, to a place in history and memory that would outlast death. Prevent that, in their understanding, was to build something so monumental, so impossible, so breathtaking, that it would serve as an anchor, a centre, a focal point that would keep humanity united and together. And the tower whose top may reach unto heaven, not just a tall building, a tower that climbs toward the very seat of the divine, that challenges the boundary between earth and sky, between the human realm and the realm of God. It's audacious, it's presumptuous, it's magnificent and terrible in equal measure, We don't know exactly how tall they envisioned it. We don't know how many thousands of workers laboured on its construction, or for how many years the project consumed their lives and energy. We only know that it was being built, that it was growing taller, that in the minds of those constructing it, this tower represented the pinnacle of human achievement and the proof of human unity. And for a moment, perhaps only a brief moment in the scheme of eternity, that dream seemed possible. The bricks were being laid, the mortar was binding them together, the tower was rising. And then something changed. The text tells us what happened next, with a simplicity that carries tremendous theological weight. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. Let's pause here, because this phrase deserves our attention. The Lord came down. This anthropomorphic description, God descending from heaven to see what humanity had built, appears throughout the biblical text, and it often signals a moment of divine judgment or intervention. But the initial description is merely observational. The Lord is coming down to see, to witness, to assess. What did God see when he looked upon this tower? What was his reaction to this monument of human ambition and cooperation? The text continues with the Lord's response, spoken to his divine council, likely the heavenly hosts. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. This is perhaps the most crucial theological statement in the entire passage. God is not saying that the people have sinned against him, though that interpretation has been common throughout history. God is not saying that they have worshipped him incorrectly or violated one of his commandments in an explicit way. What God is saying is that the unified language, combined with the unified purpose of humanity, creates a situation where they will be able to accomplish anything they set their minds to. Nothing will be restrained from them. No limitation, no obstacle, no natural barrier will be able to stop them. Imagine being the eternal, all-knowing creator of the universe, and looking down at your creation and realizing that they have unlocked a form of power, the power of total cooperation, perfect understanding, shared vision and effort, that fundamentally changes the dynamic between you and them. But what is God's concern exactly? This is where the interpretation becomes complex and the theological implications begin to multiply. Was God displeased because the people were being prideful? Because they were trying to reach toward heaven itself? Because they were in some way defying or challenging his authority? The text doesn't explicitly state that. Was God concerned because he saw that humanity, if left unchecked, would continue to accumulate power and knowledge and ability until they could rival the divine realm itself? That seems to be closer to the actual meaning of the passage. The unified language enabled unified purpose. Unified purpose enabled unprecedented achievement. Unprecedented achievement could lead to a reconfiguration of the entire cosmic order. And from a theological perspective, that represented a fundamental threat to the structure of creation itself. So God made a decision, and the Lord said, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." This is the divine solution. Not a flood to wash them away, not a plague to smite them, not a direct confrontation or a violent intervention. Instead, something almost surgical in its precision. God would divide the language. He would take the single, unified tongue that all humanity shared and fragment it into multiple tongues, multiple languages that would be mutually incomprehensible. The workers laying bricks would suddenly no longer understand the instructions being called out to them. A person asking for mortar would find themselves unable to communicate that need to someone just a few feet away. The perfect flow of communication that had made the construction possible would be shattered in an instant. The consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. With no shared language, coordinating the construction would become impossible. Workers would find themselves confused and frustrated, unable to understand what was happening around them or what was expected of them. The foreman couldn't give orders, the teams couldn't coordinate, the unified vision that had driven the project would dissolve into chaos and miscommunication. How long would construction continue under those circumstances? How long before people began to abandon the site, choosing instead to gather with those who could actually understand their words? How long before clusters of people, now speaking different languages, began to drift away from the tower and from each other, ultimately settling in different regions of the earth? The text describes the culmination of this process with understated power. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Notice the name, Babel. The text connects it to the Hebrew word balal, which means to confuse or to mix. The city that was meant to unite humanity and preserve their name becomes instead the place where humanity is confused and scattered. The monument to unity becomes a monument to division. The tower that was meant to touch the heavens instead becomes a symbol of human limitation and separation. And so the story concludes. The project that had been consuming human effort and ambition is abandoned, incomplete, left standing as a reminder of a vision that could never be realized. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world, and thank you truly for letting me be part of your evening routine. Anyway, back to the story. Now that we have the biblical account firmly in mind, let's begin to explore the theological implications of this narrative, because they are far deeper and more complex than a surface reading might suggest. The question that has occupied theologians, scholars, and thoughtful readers for centuries is deceptively simple. What exactly was God displeased with? Was it the building of the tower itself? Was it the ambition of humanity? Was it something about the nature of human cooperation that threatened the cosmic order? Or was it something else entirely? One interpretation, and probably the most common one throughout much of Christian history, focuses on pride, human hubris reaching up toward heaven itself, the defiance implicit in trying to build a structure that would touch the sky, the overreach of creation attempting to bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. From this perspective, the Tower of Babel becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive pride, about the inevitable fall that follows when human beings exceed the bounds of their proper station. This interpretation has a kind of moral clarity to it. Pride goes before a fall. Humans who think too highly of themselves will be humbled. There's a natural justice to it, a sense that the consequences flow from the transgression. But does this interpretation actually align with what the text itself says? The account doesn't explicitly mention pride. It doesn't describe God being angered by arrogance or offended by the people's ambition. Instead, it describes God as recognizing that the unified language combined with unified purpose creates a situation where nothing will be restrained from them. The emphasis is not on pride, but on power, on the recognition that humanity, if left unified, would be capable of accomplishing anything. Another interpretation, prevalent in Jewish theological tradition, views the tower as a symbol of humanity's attempt to establish itself without regard for God, to create meaning and permanence through human effort alone rather than through relation to the divine. From this perspective, the sin isn't explicitly stated in the text because it's implicit in the action. The people are trying to make a name for themselves through their own achievement, to guarantee their own permanence through brick and tar and the accumulation of human labour. They are in effect saying that they don't need God's blessing, God's permission, or God's involvement in their plans. They will secure their own future through their own effort. And while this might not be explicitly sinful in the way that, say, murder or theft is sinful, it represents a fundamental misalignment with the proper relationship between humanity and the divine. It represents an assertion of human autonomy that excludes divine sovereignty. From this perspective, God's confusion of languages isn't so much a punishment as a correction, a way of realigning humanity with reality, of reminding them that they are not in fact capable of accomplishing anything without limits, that there are boundaries to human power, and that those boundaries exist for a reason. There's yet another interpretation, more philosophical in nature, that focuses on the nature of human community and the fragmentation that diversity of language creates. This view suggests that the text is describing something that actually happened in human history, that at some point humanity did transition from a state of linguistic unity to a state of linguistic diversity, that different languages did emerge, and that this fragmentation of language created barriers to communication and understanding that have plagued human civilization ever since. From this perspective, the Tower of Babel is not primarily about punishment or divine retribution. It's about the loss of something precious, the ability to communicate perfectly, to understand each other instantly, to coordinate human effort without the friction that language barriers introduce. The confusion of languages is presented as a consequence of human ambition and overreach, yes, but it's also presented as a natural result of the growth and expansion of human civilization. As populations grew and spread, as societies became more complex, as people settled in different regions, naturally languages evolved and diverged. What the Babel narrative does is present this perfectly natural historical process as something divinely ordained, as something that was meant to happen, as something that serves a purpose in the cosmic order. These interpretations, the one focusing on pride, the one focusing on autonomy and separation from God, and the one focusing on the natural consequences of human expansion, are not mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in the minds of thoughtful readers and scholars. The text is rich enough and ambiguous enough to support multiple layers of meaning, and perhaps that is exactly what makes it so powerful. The Tower of Babel is a story about human ambition and human limitation. It's a story about what becomes possible when humans work together in perfect unity, and what is lost when that unity is shattered. It's a story about the relationship between humanity and the divine, about autonomy and dependence, about the drive to create meaning and permanence in a universe that often seems indifferent to human concerns. It's a story that has resonated across centuries and across cultures because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition. How have different religious and cultural traditions understood this narrative? How have they interpreted the theological implications and drawn lessons from the story? The answers are as diverse as humanity itself, and they reveal something fascinating about how different communities of faith understand God, power, human nature, and the proper ordering of the world. In Jewish tradition, the Tower of Babel occupies a complex and sometimes contradictory place. The rabbinical interpretation, which emerged in the Talmud and in Midrashic literature, often emphasizes themes of rebellion and the assertion of human will apart from divine guidance. Some rabbinical sources suggest that the people of Babel weren't merely trying to build a tall tower. They were engaged in active rebellion against God, wanting to build a tower so high that they could wage war against heaven itself. Other rabbinic sources, however, take a more nuanced view, suggesting that the sin of Babel was not primarily about the tower at all, but about the arrogance and conflict that characterized the people building it. There's a teaching in the Talmud that suggests the people of Babel were more unified and cooperative than any subsequent human civilization, and yet precisely because they were unified in their defiance and rebellion, they were scattered. In this interpretation, it's not cooperation itself that's the problem, but cooperation in service of a goal that denies or defies divine authority. What's interesting about the Jewish interpretive tradition is that it often sees the confusion of languages not as a permanent curse, but as a consequence that eventually led to something good. The ability of humanity to develop different cultures and traditions, each with their own wisdom and way of approaching the divine. The fragmentation that resulted from Babel, in this view, isn't purely negative. It created the diversity of human experience. In Christian tradition, the Tower of Babel is often presented as a narrative parallel to other stories of human presumption and divine correction. Medieval theologians frequently compared the Tower of Babel to the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden, seeing both as examples of human pride leading to catastrophic consequences. The tower reaches toward heaven just as Adam and Eve reached toward the knowledge that God had forbidden them. Both acts represent an overstepping of human boundaries, a refusal to accept the limits that God has set. Some Christian interpreters have also seen the Tower of Babel as a precursor to the Incarnation and Pentecost, the coming of Jesus Christ and the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. In this interpretive framework, the confusion of languages at Babel represents the fundamental brokenness of human communication and human community, and the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost represents the healing of that brokenness, at least within the community of believers. When the apostles received the gifts of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, one of those gifts was the ability to speak in tongues, for people who had never learned each other's languages to suddenly understand each other perfectly, to communicate about the wonders of God in a way that transcended linguistic barriers. From this perspective, Pentecost reverses Babel. Where Babel scattered humanity and confused their speech, Pentecost unites believers in a deeper communion that exists beyond and above language itself. It's a remarkably hopeful interpretive move, transforming a story of fragmentation into a narrative arc that culminates in restoration. In Islamic tradition, the Tower of Babel occupies a position in the sacred narrative, but is understood somewhat differently than it is in Jewish and Christian sources. The Quran references Babel, or as it's called in Arabic, Ilaf, though the Quranic account is brief and somewhat different in emphasis from the biblical narrative. Islamic tradition generally understands the tower as a monument to human defiance and arrogance. Unlike Christian and Jewish traditions, it emphasizes the consequences of refusing to recognize divine authority and human dependence on God. Some Islamic scholars have connected the Tower of Babel to other narratives in the Quran about communities that rejected God's messengers and were consequently punished or scattered. The confusion of languages is understood as a sign of divine power and sovereignty, a reminder that no human accomplishment, no matter how impressive, can stand against the will of God. But Islamic tradition also emphasizes something that's present in the biblical text but sometimes downplayed in Christian interpretation: the actual architectural and engineering achievement represented by the tower. The Quran acknowledges that the people of Babel were skilled in building and construction, that they had the knowledge and ability to attempt something monumentally ambitious. The sin wasn't in the attempt itself, but in the spirit of defiance and pride in which it was undertaken. This suggests a perspective that distinguishes between human achievement and human arrogance, between the accomplishment itself and the attitude with which it was pursued. What's fascinating about these diverse interpretations is that they all share certain common themes, even as they emphasize different aspects of the narrative. All of them recognize the Tower of Babel as a story about human ambition and its limits. All of them understand the confusion of languages as a consequence or intervention related to human relationship with the divine. All of them grapple with the question of what exactly constitutes the transgression. Is it pride, rebellion, autonomy, or something more subtle and complex? And all of them, in their different ways, acknowledge that the narrative is describing a moment of fundamental change in human history, a transition from one state of being to another that has permanent and ongoing consequences. The diversity of interpretations across religious traditions is itself a kind of commentary on what the story is about. The fact that different communities of faith speaking different theological languages can find different layers of meaning in the Babel narrative is perhaps a fitting tribute to the richness and depth of the original text. It's a story that continues to challenge and illuminate, to provoke questions and invite contemplation, even after thousands of years. The Tower of Babel stands in our imagination the way it stood in ancient Shinar, reaching upward, incomplete, a monument to both human aspiration and human limitation. And in our sleep and in our waking, we continue to meditate on what it means. As we move from the ancient text into the dust and ruins of archaeology, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between myth and history. What the Bible described in symbolic language, a tower reaching toward the heavens, a monument to human pride and ambition, emerges into sharper focus when we turn our attention to the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia. Here, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we encounter structures that may well have inspired the Tower of Babel narrative. But these were not mere legend or theological allegory. These were real buildings, constructed with purpose and precision, rising above the flat Mesopotamian plains with such grandeur that they impressed observers across centuries and cultures. To understand what the Tower of Babel might have been, we must first understand the ziggurat, a distinctly Mesopotamian architectural form that dominated the religious and civic landscape of ancient civilization for nearly 2,000 years. The ziggurat was not unique to Babylon, though Babylon's greatest ziggurat remains the most famous. This architectural tradition flourished throughout Mesopotamia, from the earliest cities of Sumer to the great imperial capitals of Babylon and Assyria. A ziggurat was fundamentally a temple tower, a structure built in a series of stepped, decreasing levels, creating a pyramid-like form that rose dramatically from the surrounding cityscape. The word ziggurat itself derives from the Akkadian word zakaru, meaning to be high or to rise up. These buildings were not mere aesthetic statements, though they were certainly impressive to behold. They served profound religious and practical purposes. The uppermost temple, accessible only by staircases and ramps, was believed to be the dwelling place of the god to whom the ziggurat was dedicated. By constructing these towers, Mesopotamian rulers created physical points of connection between the earthly realm and the divine, sacred spaces where priests could communicate with the gods, make offerings, and divine the will of heaven. The height of a ziggurat was significant not merely as engineering achievement, but as theological statement, The higher the tower, the closer one could approach the divine realm. Can you imagine the sensation of ascending such a structure, level after level, watching the world beneath you shrink away until you stood in a thin space between earth and sky? The construction of a ziggurat was among the most ambitious projects a Mesopotamian city-state or empire could undertake. These were not projects completed in a single generation. A major ziggurat might require decades to build, demanding the marshalling of enormous resources, the coordination of thousands of workers, and the careful planning of architects and engineers. Consider the raw materials needed. The principal building material was the mud brick, not sun-baked adobe, but properly fired clay bricks that could withstand the elements and support tremendous weight. A single large ziggurat required literally millions of these bricks. The Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, was constructed using an estimated 15 million mud bricks, each one individually made, dried, and carefully placed. The labour required to produce that many bricks would have occupied thousands of workers over many years. Beyond the bricks themselves, the construction demanded bitumen, that thick, tar-like substance that naturally seeps from the earth in various locations throughout Mesopotamia. This bitumen served as mortar, holding the bricks together and waterproofing the structure against the damage caused by rain and the occasional flooding that threatened the Mesopotamian plains. The Genesis narrative's reference to slime, used as mortar, takes on new resonance when we consider the actual building techniques of ancient Mesopotamia. This was not poetic exaggeration, but an accurate description of the materials these ancient builders employed. The slime was indeed bitumen, the dark, sticky substance that gives Mesopotamian architecture its characteristic appearance in the archaeological record. The construction process itself, while mechanized by ancient standards, was fundamentally dependent on organized human labor. There is considerable debate among scholars as to whether this labor was entirely voluntary. Corvée labor required of citizens during seasonal periods, or included significant numbers of enslaved workers. Archaeological evidence and contemporary texts suggest a complex system that likely combined all of these elements. What seems certain is that the construction of a major ziggurat represented a tremendous mobilization of human effort, coordinated by a central authority with the power to command resources and direct the work of thousands. Imagine the scene: vast brick-making workshops operating continuously, producing millions of uniform bricks, quarries being worked to extract clay, bitumen being transported from distant sources, and on the building site itself, thousands of workers arranging bricks into massive walls level upon level under the supervision of skilled architects and foremen. The work would have been back-breaking, seasonal in nature, conducted primarily during the drier months when the ground was firm enough to support the weight of construction and when clay could be properly dried. The workers would have laboured in the intense heat of the Mesopotamian sun, covered in brick dust and mud, pushing and pulling materials into position, fitting thousands upon thousands of individual components into a unified structure that might take 20 or 30 years to complete. Now let us direct our attention specifically to the Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, the structure most scholars believe to be the historical foundation for the Tower of Babel narrative. The Etemenanki was not the oldest ziggurat in Mesopotamia, nor was it the largest by some measures, but it held a unique significance. It was the ziggurat of Babylon during the height of that city's power and influence, and it was the object of particular attention and investment by Nebuchadnezzar II, one of the greatest kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The dimensions of the Etemenanki are known to us through several sources. The most important of these is the Asagala tablet, an ancient Babylonian text that describes in detail the measurements and characteristics of the temple complex and its central tower. According to this text, and corroborated by archaeological evidence, the Etemenanki rose to a height of approximately 91 metres, roughly 300 feet, or about the height of a modern 30-storey building. The base of the structure was nearly square, measuring approximately 91 metres on each side. Picture for a moment what this meant. A structure more than 300 feet tall, rising from a base nearly 300 feet across, it would have dominated the Mesopotamian landscape in a way difficult for modern minds to fully appreciate. Standing at the foot of such a tower, you would have had to tilt your head back at nearly a 45-degree angle to see the summit. Your eyes would have followed the massive walls upward, tier after tier, until the top sanctuary became a distant point against the sky. The Etemenanki was not a single unified tower, but rather a complex of 7 distinct levels, each one smaller than the one beneath it, creating that characteristic stepped pyramid silhouette. Each level was connected to the next by an internal staircase and external ramps that spiraled around the structure. The building was constructed almost entirely of mud brick, with bitumen as the binding mortar. The base was constructed with the greatest care and heaviest materials, as it needed to support the enormous weight of the entire structure rising above it. As one ascended through the levels, the walls became progressively thinner and lighter, though still formidable in their construction. The interior spaces within the lower levels served various functions: storage, administrative spaces, perhaps housing for the priests who maintained the temple. But the true purpose of the structure, this sacred heart toward which all this construction was directed, lay at the summit, the uppermost sanctuary, the temple of Marduk himself. This topmost sanctuary was the crown jewel of the entire structure. It was a relatively modest building compared to the vast bulk of the tower beneath it, but it was incomparably precious in religious and symbolic terms. This was the inner chamber where the image of Marduk was kept, where priests conducted the most sacred rites of the Babylonian religion, where the god himself was believed to dwell. The sanctuary was constructed of imported materials more precious than brick, stone and wood brought from distant lands. It was adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, with precious objects that glinted in the Mesopotamian sunlight. The walls were decorated with inscriptions and images celebrating the god and the king who had built this monument to divine power. And here we arrive at one of the most remarkable aspects of the Etemenanki's appearance: the famous glazed tiles that covered much of its external surface. These were not simple decoration. They represented a tremendous technical and artistic achievement. The bricks were covered with a glaze, a ceramic coating of brilliant blue, the colour of the sky and of lapis lazuli, one of the most precious materials known to the ancient world. This blue glaze was infused with gold and precious metals, creating a surface that would have shimmered and gleamed in the sunlight. Imagine standing in the Mesopotamian plains, surrounded by the dusty tan and brown of the landscape, and seeing this tower rise before you, its surface brilliant blue and gold, seeming almost to glow as if lit from within. What would such a sight have inspired in the hearts of those who beheld it? Awe, certainly, wonder, perhaps also a complex mixture of admiration for human achievement and anxiety at such blatant assertion of power and ambition. The construction history of the Etemenanki is intimately connected with the rise of Babylon as a dominant power in Mesopotamia. The ziggurat was not erected as a sudden massive project in a single period, but rather was built, expanded and rebuilt over centuries as successive kings invested in its aggrandizement. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that a ziggurat dedicated to Marduk stood at this site since at least the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. However, the structure known to history, the one that impressed Herodotus and dominated the Babylonian landscape, was largely the creation of Nebuchadnezzar II, the great Neo-Babylonian king who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne of a Mesopotamia transformed by Assyrian dominance, then freed from Assyrian rule. He used the resources of this freedom and his own exceptional abilities to transform Babylon from a regional power into an empire that rivaled any force in the ancient world. The physical transformation of Babylon itself became a central concern of his reign. He rebuilt and enlarged the city walls, constructed the famous Ishtar Gate, created the Hanging Gardens, and greatly expanded and beautified the Etemenanki. Nebuchadnezzar made this ziggurat the centerpiece of a vast temple complex, the Esagila, meaning House of the Lofty Head, which occupied an enormous area at the heart of Babylon. This temple complex was not merely a religious site, but a symbol of Babylonian power and the supremacy of Marduk among the gods. By investing such tremendous resources in its expansion and beautification, Nebuchadnezzar was making a theological and political statement. "This is what we are capable of," the tower proclaimed. "This is what we have built. This is what we have accomplished." The Esagila tablet, which we have already mentioned, provides us with invaluable information about the structure that Nebuchadnezzar and his predecessors created. This ancient text, preserved in cuneiform on a clay tablet and now housed in museums where scholars can study it, gives precise dimensions and descriptions of the temple complex and the Etemenanki. The tablet tells us that the base of the Etemenanke measured 91.5 meters on each side, and that it rose to a height of approximately 91 meters. It describes the structure's 7 levels, the temples and shrines contained within it, the stairways and ramps that connected them. It provides a level of technical detail that validates what we can learn from archaeological remains and helps us reconstruct what this ancient building must have looked like when it stood in its full glory. But there is another ancient source that provides us with something perhaps even more valuable, an eyewitness account or something close to one. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, travelled to Babylon and saw the Etemenanke with his own eyes. What he witnessed was a structure that had already stood for several centuries, that had been built and rebuilt by multiple generations of kings, that was still serving as the centre of Babylonian religious life. Herodotus's description of the Etemenanke is both precise and filled with wonder. He tells us that the tower rose to a height he could measure, a height that corresponds reasonably well with what the Asagala tablet and archaeology tell us. He describes ascending the structure, presumably by the great staircases and ramps that spiralled around it. He notes the temples contained within the various levels, the treasures and religious objects housed there. He describes a tremendous temple at the summit, a golden shrine where the image of Marduk was kept. Herodotus had a weakness for the marvellous and sometimes reported things he heard second-hand without sufficient skepticism. Yet his description of the Etemenanke seems grounded in careful observation. He was describing something he had actually seen, a structure that existed in his own time. This is remarkable. Within just over 200 years of the time of Nebuchadnezzar, this structure that had required decades to construct and millions of bricks to complete was still standing, still impressive enough to command the attention and admiration of a sophisticated observer from distant Greece. The Etemenanke was not a temporary structure or a failed project. It was a durable monument that endured for centuries, that continued to impress even as the political fortunes of Babylon itself eventually declined. The sensory experience of encountering such a structure would have been overwhelming. Approaching Babylon from the surrounding plains, a traveller would have seen the Etemenanke long before reaching the city walls. It would have risen against the sky, that blue-glazed tower visible from many miles away, growing larger and more imposing as one drew nearer. The closer you came, the more the tower would have seemed to dwarf everything around it. Babylon itself, despite being a great city surrounded by walls and filled with impressive buildings, would have seemed to exist in the shadow of this central tower. As you entered the city proper, moving through the Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue walls and bronze lions, you would have been led inexorably toward the Etemenanke. The streets of Babylon were laid out with the tower in mind. You could not move through the city without being aware of it, without having your gaze drawn upward toward its summit. The sound environment around the Etemenanke would have been distinctive. Vast numbers of priests, administrators and workers would have occupied the temple complex at any given time. There would have been the sounds of ritual, the chanting of priests, the music of instruments used in religious ceremonies, the sounds of sacrificial animals. There would have been the sounds of commerce and activity, as visitors, pilgrims and workers moved through the complex. The smell would have been complex as well, incense burning in the temples, animals used in sacrifice, the dust raised by thousands of feet moving through the courtyards and corridors, the distinctive smell of the Mesopotamian climate, hot, dry, with the ever-present taint of the river and the irrigation system that sustained the city. And what of the experience of ascending the tower itself? Those permitted to climb those ancient staircases and ramps would have experienced a remarkable journey. Starting at the base, surrounded by massive mud brick walls, you would have begun your ascent. The first staircase might have been constructed of stone or fired brick, worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. As you climbed, your perspective would have shifted moment by moment. What had seemed impossibly high from the ground would have gradually come into reach. Level by level, you would have emerged onto the terraces that crowned each of the 7 stages of the tower. With each level, the city beneath would have receded. The surrounding streets and buildings would have appeared smaller and more distant. The Euphrates River, flowing through Babylon, would have become visible from a new vantage point with each ascent. The city walls, built to protect against enemies and rising to perhaps 15 meters or more, would have seemed progressively less imposing as you climbed higher. By the time you reached the 3rd or 4th level, you would have been higher than any other structure in the city. You would have been looking down on temples, palaces, and buildings that represented centuries of human achievement and artistry. The wind would have become perceptible as you climbed higher, carrying with it the scents and sounds of the city below, but also the drier air of the upper atmosphere, thinner and colder than the stifling heat of the Mesopotamian plains. The final ascent to the summit temple would have been the most carefully constructed, perhaps the most beautifully decorated section. Here, reserved for priests and high officials, the interior would have been lit perhaps by light, filtering through carefully designed windows, or perhaps only by torches and lamps whose light would dance on walls decorated with gold and precious materials. And then, arriving at last at the summit, standing in the sanctuary of Marduk himself, you would have had an experience of genuine transcendence. The entire world of Babylon would have stretched out beneath you in all directions. The patchwork of irrigated fields surrounding the city would have been visible to the horizon. The river would have been a silver thread winding through the landscape. Other settlements and cities would have been visible in the distance, small and distant. In this moment, standing at this tremendous height, in a space reserved for the divine and for human intermediaries between the human and divine realms, the religious and political purposes of this extraordinary building would have been made viscerally apparent. You would have understood, not merely intellectually but through your entire body and consciousness, why this tower had been built. You would have felt the aspiration it represented, the desire to create a point of contact between the human and the divine, a place where mortal concerns seemed small and the universe itself seemed present and immediate. The ziggurat rose above the city, but it was only one jewel among many in the vast expanse of Babylon itself. Beyond the sacred precinct, stretching across the plains of Mesopotamia, stood one of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world had ever constructed, a metropolis that commanded the attention of neighbouring kingdoms, that drew merchants from distant lands, that stood as a testament to human ambition and architectural mastery. Babylon was not merely a collection of buildings and walls, it was a living, breathing organism of commerce, religion, learning, and power. When you imagine walking through Babylon at the height of its grandeur, perhaps around the 6th century before the Common Era, when King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled, you must picture a city unlike anything most ancient people had ever experienced, a place of dazzling colours, intricate designs, and monuments that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. As you pass through the outer walls and move toward the centre of the city, the first structure that captures your attention is the Ishtar Gate, one of the most magnificently decorated entrances to any ancient city. This gate was not merely functional, though it certainly controlled access to Babylon's inner districts. It was a declaration of power, a monument to the goddess Ishtar, a work of art on a scale that modern visitors to museums housing fragments of it still find breathtaking. Imagine approaching this gate as an ancient visitor would have, dusty from your journey across the desert, perhaps leading a caravan of goods or travelling on foot with relatives. As you draw near, the gate gradually comes into focus, and what you see causes you to pause. The entire surface is covered in glazed bricks, thousands upon thousands of them, and they gleam in the intense Mesopotamian sun with a deep, brilliant blue that seems almost unnatural in its richness. This was not the blue of dyes or paints that might fade with time and weather. This was glazed ceramic, baked to permanence, engineered to last for centuries. Against this blue backdrop, images emerge in relief, dragons and bulls depicted in the most exquisite detail. The dragons, known as mushushu in the Akkadian language, are portrayed in profile with sinuous bodies, prominent horns, and scales that catch the light. The bulls, muscular and dignified, stride forward as if the gate itself is a living, breathing thing. The reliefs were not merely brown or tan, they were rendered in brilliant gold and white, colours that would have been applied with precious glazes and metalwork. To stand before the Ishtar Gate would have been to stand before an almost overwhelming display of wealth, technical mastery and religious devotion. The gate served as a threshold between the everyday world and the sacred city beyond, a moment of transition where a visitor's perception of the world shifted, where one entered a space touched by divine presence and royal power. Passing through that magnificent gateway, you would find yourself on the processional way, the grand avenue that led through the heart of Babylon. This was not simply a street, though millions of people traversed it in their daily lives. It was a carefully designed ceremonial route, wide enough for processions of priests and the king himself to pass in grand spectacle. The processional way was itself lined with walls, and along those walls ran more reliefs, more of those glazed brick images of the protective creatures of Babylon. The avenue created a sense of transition, of movement towards something sacred and important. If you walked the processional way during a festival or religious ceremony, you would have experienced Babylon at its most vibrant and overwhelming. Priests in ceremonial dress, musicians playing instruments whose sounds echoed between the high walls, the rhythmic percussion of drums and the haunting tones of lyres and harps filling the air. The smell would have been complex. Incense burning in braziers positioned along the route, the dust raised by thousands of feet, the sweat and the perfumes worn by nobility and merchants. The heat would have been intense, the sun beating down on the brick and stone reflecting upward, creating a shimmering quality to the air itself. Beyond the processional way and the sacred precincts lay the broader city, a sprawling metropolis that housed perhaps 250,000 people at its peak, though scholars debate these figures and suggest numbers both higher and lower, depending on the era and the estimate. The walls that surrounded Babylon were legendary even in ancient times. Herodotus, the Greek historian who travelled and wrote centuries after Babylon's founding, claimed that these walls were so thick and wide that a chariot could turn around on top of them, that 4 horses pulling a carriage could make a complete rotation without difficulty. Modern archaeology suggests this may be an exaggeration, though the walls were certainly immense, constructed of sun-baked mud brick faced with more permanent materials, rising perhaps 50 or 60 feet or more into the air. These walls were not merely defensive structures, though they certainly protected the city from invasion. They were also statements of permanence, declarations that this city would endure, that human civilization had created something that would last. The walls enclosed and defined Babylon, creating a clear boundary between the ordered, carefully organized city and the wild, unsettled territories beyond. The daily life within Babylon's walls was characterized by a remarkable diversity of activity and purpose. In the markets, and Babylon had many markets, merchants from distant lands set up stalls and temporary shops. There were merchants dealing in grain, the staple crop that sustained the city, and was transported along the Euphrates River, which ran through Babylon itself. There were spice merchants, their goods having been transported along trade routes stretching into the highlands and beyond. Perfume dealers offered rare essences imported from distant lands, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, cedar oil from the mountains, rose water and other fragrant distillations. Cloth merchants displayed fabrics dyed in brilliant colours, purples that came from expensive dyes, reds, blues and yellows, in shades that reflected the sophistication of Babylonian textile production. Metalworkers hammered copper and bronze, creating tools, weapons, decorative items and household goods. Potters crafted vessels of all sizes and purposes, storage jars for grain and wine, drinking cups, decorated vessels meant for religious purposes or display in wealthy homes. The cacophony of the market would have been extraordinary. Merchants calling out their wares, customers bargaining, animals, donkeys, horses, sometimes camels, braying and neighing, the sounds of metalworking, the calls of children weaving between the stalls. Beyond the markets, the city was organised in distinct districts, each with its own character and purpose. The residential areas, where ordinary citizens lived in modest homes built of mud brick with flat roofs, where families would spend warm evenings, were arranged in a network of streets and alleyways. These were not randomly placed but carefully planned, with main avenues running in grid-like patterns, evidence of the same organisational impulse that had built the processional way and aligned the ziggurat. The homes of wealthy merchants and high-ranking officials were more substantial, featuring multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards where the family could gather away from the intense heat of the street. These wealthier homes might have contained private wells or carefully engineered systems to access water, an incredibly valuable resource in the arid climate of Mesopotamia. The homes of scribes, those educated men who could read and write, who formed the administrative backbone of Babylon, were located in districts near centres of learning, near the temples where much of the government business took place, near the places where knowledge was recorded and preserved. The priests and religious officials of Babylon occupied a position of great authority and privilege. Their homes were often substantial, located near the temples and ziggurats. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, underwent years of training in religious lore, in the interpretation of omens, in the maintenance of rituals that were believed to sustain cosmic order itself. The priests were custodians of knowledge, keepers of tradition, intermediaries between the divine and the human. They managed vast agricultural estates, they conducted the major religious ceremonies, they advised kings and nobles on matters of spiritual and cosmic significance. The ordinary labourers of Babylon, the people who carried water, who worked in construction, who hauled goods, who performed the endless physical labour required to maintain a city, lived in simple, often cramped conditions. Their homes were small, usually single-room structures or at most 2 or 3 rooms. Yet even these humble dwellings were part of Babylon, part of its intricate social fabric. Canals branched off from the river, distributing water throughout the city for irrigation, for drinking, for the numerous practical purposes of urban life. These canals were not simple ditches but engineered structures, maintained by skilled workers, managed with careful attention to ensure fair distribution of this precious resource. The larger canals had stone-lined banks, or were enclosed in brick-lined channels. Water was lifted from lower levels to higher areas using devices that relied on human or animal power, rotating drums that would carry water in compartments, systems of pulleys and buckets that brought water from the river or deep wells up to where it was needed. The sounds of water, splashing, flowing, trickling, would have been constant throughout the city, a reminder of the careful management required to sustain urban life in the Mesopotamian climate. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding ancient Babylon involves the legendary Hanging Gardens, supposedly one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These gardens were described as a marvel of irrigation technology, supposedly featuring plants and trees arranged on elevated terraces or arches, with water cascading down in streams and fountains, creating a lush green oasis within the city. Ancient writers describe the gardens as having been built by King Nebuchadnezzar II for his wife, Amytis, who supposedly was homesick for the mountainous regions of her native Media. The Hanging Gardens were supposedly so magnificent that they inspired awe and wonder in all who saw them, and they became legendary throughout the ancient world. Yet, and this is a fascinating aspect of Babylon's history, there is no archaeological evidence that the Hanging Gardens ever actually existed in Babylon. No ruins have been discovered, no foundations that match descriptions, no artifacts that definitively point to their location or existence. Some scholars have suggested that the gardens may have been in a different city entirely, perhaps Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, or that they were a literary invention, a myth created by ancient writers who heard tales of Babylon's magnificence and elaborated upon them. Other scholars have argued that the gardens may have been too magnificent, too fragile to survive until the present day. That time and conquest and the natural processes of decay erased all evidence. What we can say with certainty is that Babylon's engineers and gardeners possessed the knowledge and skill to have created such gardens if they had chosen to do so. The water systems they built, the irrigation technology they developed, the botanical knowledge they possessed, all of these suggest that the creation of extensive hanging gardens would have been technically feasible. Whether they actually existed or not, the legend of the Hanging Gardens speaks to something true about Babylon, its reputation for magnificence, for the marshalling of resources toward extraordinary ends, for the creation of beauty and wonder in a harsh and demanding environment. Babylon was not merely a city of commerce and religious devotion, it was a centre of learning and intellectual achievement that rivaled or surpassed any other city in the ancient world. The scribble schools of Babylon trained young men in the art of writing, not merely the mechanical copying of documents, but the deep understanding of language, literature, mathematics, and administrative practice that would allow them to function as educated professionals in Babylonian society. The curriculum of these schools included the study of earlier Sumerian texts, the great works of Babylonian literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of human literature, telling the story of a king's quest for immortality and his friendship with Enkidu. Students learned mathematics, not merely arithmetic but geometry and algebra, systems of calculation that allowed Babylonian scholars to survey land, construct buildings, and calculate celestial movements. They studied astronomy, creating elaborate systems for tracking and predicting the movements of celestial bodies. The Babylonians did not possess telescopes or the mathematical frameworks that would develop in later centuries, Yet they developed sophisticated models of planetary motion. They created the zodiac, the division of the sky into 12 constellations that still influences astrology and astronomical tradition. The clay tablets they created recorded the positions of planets, the dates and times of eclipses, the regular cycles of celestial phenomena. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the most important legal documents of the ancient world, exemplified Babylon's commitment to organize law and justice. Created by King Hammurabi in the 18th century before the Common Era, the code contained hundreds of laws addressing everything from commerce to family relationships to criminal justice. The laws were not presented as abstract principles but as specific provisions. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out, revealing both the sophistication of Babylonian legal thinking and the often harsh nature of justice in the ancient world. The code was not merely a written document stored in an archive. It was carved into stone and displayed publicly so that all citizens could, at least in theory, know the laws they were expected to follow. This represented a revolutionary concept, that laws should be known, accessible, and consistently applied, rather than being arbitrary pronouncements from a ruler's whim. To walk through Babylon at its height was to experience a sensory world almost overwhelming in its intensity. The heat of the Mesopotamian sun was relentless, beating down on the city, creating mirages on the horizon. The intense sunlight made colours appear almost unnaturally vivid, the blue of the Ishtar Gate seeming almost supernatural, the golds of the reliefs gleaming brilliantly, the whites and reds of the buildings creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted throughout the day. The sounds of the city were constant, the work sounds of construction and craftsmanship, the calls of merchants and customers, the bells and horns used to regulate city life, the footsteps of countless people moving through streets and marketplaces. The smells would have been complex and layered. The ever-present smell of dust, the sweet smell of incense burning in temples and homes, the less pleasant odours of human habitation, waste, sweat, animals. The taste of Babylon's water, drawn from the Euphrates or from wells, would have been present in the food and drink, sometimes clean and refreshing, sometimes carrying the silt of the river. And if you placed your hand on a wall on a hot afternoon, you would feel the intense heat radiating from the baked brick and stone, a heat so intense that even touching it became uncomfortable. If you're still awake and enjoying this, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. Now let's get back to exploring Babylon, and the events that would ultimately lead to its transformation, and the end of the tower that once inspired such awe and fear. Imagine standing in ancient Mesopotamia, watching the confusion unfold as workers suddenly cannot understand one another. They reach for the same stone, but the words that once unified them have fractured into thousands of distinct forms. The Tower of Babel story has captivated civilizations for millennia, but at its heart lies a puzzling question, one that science has spent centuries trying to answer. If humanity once shared a common language, what evidence might we find of this ancient unity, and what does the archaeological and linguistic record actually reveal about how languages emerged and diversified across our world? Today, roughly 7,000 distinct languages exist on Earth, a stunning diversity that seems to confirm the Babel narrative in the most literal sense. From the tonal languages of Southeast Asia to the click consonants of African tongues, from the complex case systems of Slavic languages to the polysynthetic structures of indigenous American languages, human communication has fractured into an almost bewildering array of forms. Yet this diversity is not random chaos. Within this apparent Babel of tongues, linguists have discovered profound patterns, mathematical regularities, shared structural principles, and deep genealogical relationships that suggest not a sudden divine intervention, but rather a slow, methodical process of linguistic evolution stretching back tens of thousands of years. The science that studies how languages change and diverge is called historical linguistics, a discipline that emerged in the late 18th century when scholars began to notice striking similarities between seemingly unrelated languages. A scholar named Sir William Jones, studying Sanskrit in colonial India, observed that this ancient language possessed remarkable parallels to Greek and Latin. The resemblances were too systematic, too numerous to be coincidental. Words for family members, basic numbers, and fundamental concepts showed patterns of correspondence that suggested these languages must have shared a common ancestor. This realization sparked a revolution in linguistic thinking. If languages could be traced backward through time, perhaps, just perhaps, humanity could reconstruct the actual ancestor language from which all these modern tongues descended. The hunt for this primordial language led linguists to propose the existence of Proto-Indo-European, a reconstructed tongue spoken perhaps 6,000 years ago by nomadic peoples dwelling on the steppes north of the Black Sea. Proto-Indo-European was never directly written down. No ancient text preserves it. Instead, linguists reconstructed it through painstaking comparative analysis, using a technique called the comparative method. By examining regular sound correspondences across related languages, the way that Latin P often corresponds to Sanskrit P, or how Latin D patterns with Sanskrit D in cognate words, researchers could work backward through time, peeling away layers of linguistic change like an archaeologist excavating a tell. The work was meticulous, patient, and revolutionary. Over decades, linguists rebuilt substantial portions of Proto-Indo-European vocabulary and grammar, revealing a language that spoke to the culture of its speakers, a tongue rich in words for horses, wagons, and pastoral pursuits, hinting at a society of mobile herders rather than settled farmers. The implications were staggering. From a single ancestral language, the theory proposed, had emerged the vast family of Indo-European languages, a family so large and geographically widespread that it includes English and Bengali, Spanish and Russian, Greek and Persian, and hundreds of other languages spoken by roughly 3 billion people today. These languages had not borrowed from some universal linguistic template. Rather, they had evolved, transformed, and diversified through the same processes of gradual change that Darwin would describe for biological species. Languages, it seemed, had their own evolutionary history, their own family trees. But Proto-Indo-European was not the only ancestral language that linguists proposed. Alongside it emerged the Sino-Tibetan family, uniting the languages of East and Southeast Asia. The Afroasiatic family encompassed the languages of North Africa and the Middle East. The Dravidian languages of South India seemed to form their own distinct group. The Altaic languages of Central Asia, the Niger-Congo languages of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Austronesian languages that scattered across the Pacific, each represented a deep genealogical unity among populations that history and geography had separated. Linguists developed taxonomies of language families, drawing family trees that branched and subdivided, showing how parent languages had split into daughter languages, which themselves diversified into further descendants. Language trees grew to fill scholarly journals and textbooks, monuments to the slow divergence of human speech across time and space. From these observations came a tantalizing question. If Indo-European languages shared a common ancestor, and Sino-Tibetan languages shared an ancestor, and Afroasiatic languages shared an ancestor, might all these families themselves be distantly related? Might there exist, somewhere in the deepest past, an ancestral language from which all human language descended? This speculation led to the formulation of the Nostratic hypothesis, a bold and controversial proposal that attempted to group the world's major language families into even larger superfamilies, descended from a single primordial tongue. The hypothesis emerged in the 20th century, promoted by scholars who saw tantalizing similarities linking Indo-European, Altaic, Dravidian, and Afroasiatic languages. If true, the Nostratic hypothesis would suggest that all human language diverged from a single source between 10 and 15,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. The Nostratic hypothesis remains deeply controversial. Many linguists question whether the alleged connections are genuine or merely coincidental, the product of chance resemblances that accumulate when comparing the vocabularies of distant language families. Language changes so rapidly, and sound shifts so readily, that detecting genuine relatedness becomes nearly impossible beyond a certain chronological depth. The farther back in time we attempt to trace languages, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish true cognates, words genuinely descended from a common ancestor, from lookalikes produced by pure chance. Some scholars estimate that language relationships become effectively undetectable beyond perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 years of separation. Others push the horizon back further, but all agree that there exists some ultimate chronological limit, a point beyond which the true history of languages dissolves into indeterminable fog. This raises a fascinating question. If humanity did once share a common language, when might that have occurred? The answer requires turning from linguistics to genetics and archaeology, disciplines that offer their own windows into humanity's deep past. Genetic evidence suggests that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa between 100 and 200,000 years ago. For perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 years, the evidence indicates these early humans lived in relatively small groups, separated by geography and distance. These groups would have been speaking different languages, or at least different dialects that would gradually have diverged into distinct languages over the centuries. As human populations expanded, migrating across continents and adapting to new environments, the linguistic divergence would have accelerated. By 10,000 years ago, when humanity transitioned to agriculture and began building the first settled cities, the languages of the world had already fragmented into dozens of distinct families. The genetic and archaeological evidence thus suggests that the concept of a single, unified human language may belong not to the recent historical past, but to the distant prehistoric era, if it ever existed at all. This is where the Sumerian language enters the story with peculiar significance. Sumerian was one of the world's oldest written languages, recorded on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to at least 3200 BCE, and possibly earlier. The Sumerians, who inhabited the southern reaches of Mesopotamia around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, developed the world's first true system of writing, not simply recording isolated words or symbols, but capturing the full grammar and vocabulary of their language in standardized form. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay, eventually called cuneiform, represented sounds and concepts with systematic regularity. Yet here is the mystery. Sumerian appears to be a language isolate, a tongue with no known relatives, no obvious kinship to the languages spoken by neighbouring peoples. Linguists have proposed various theories. Perhaps Sumerian was the last surviving member of a language family whose other descendants vanished into history. Perhaps it represented a substrate language, spoken by a pre-Semitic population that inhabited Mesopotamia before the arrival of Semitic-speaking peoples. Or perhaps it truly was, in some sense, an orphaned language, a living relic from an earlier phase of linguistic diversity, cut off from its distant relatives by geography and time. Sumerian is not alone in this isolation. The Basque language, spoken in the Pyrenees region between Spain and France, represents another stubborn language isolate, seemingly unrelated to any other living tongue. Despite centuries of scholarly effort, linguists have failed to establish firm connections between Basque and the Indo-European languages that surround it, or indeed to any other known language family. The Basques themselves preserve oral traditions claiming descent from indigenous peoples who inhabited their region before the arrival of Indo-European speakers. Genetic evidence supports this picture. Basque populations do show genetic markers distinct from their neighbours, suggesting a long period of relative isolation. Thus, Basque persists as a linguistic enigma, a living window into a more distant and more diversified human past. Other language isolates dot the globe. Burushaski, spoken in the mountains of northern Pakistan, Ket, spoken by a small population in Siberia, and various sign languages developed independently by deaf communities all over the world. These orphaned languages suggest that the process of linguistic divergence and consolidation remains incomplete. We do not live in a world where languages have settled into stable families. We live in a world of constant linguistic change where new languages are being born, pidgins and creoles emerging from linguistic contact, and where others are dying at a rate of roughly one language every 2 weeks. The irony that haunts the Babel narrative becomes acute when we consider the origins of writing itself. The very region of the world where the Tower of Babel presumably stood, the floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates in ancient Mesopotamia, was precisely where humanity's first great solution to the language problem emerged. The Sumerians invented writing not for literary or artistic purposes, but for the practical, bureaucratic necessity of record-keeping. As their civilization grew more complex, with temple holdings and trade goods and tax obligations to track, the pressure to record information in permanent form became irresistible. Writing began as accounting, as a system for marking quantities and ownership. Gradually it evolved into a system capable of capturing language itself, every word, every grammatical form, every nuance of meaning. Writing, in essence, was humanity's technological response to the fragmentation of language, where speech falters across distance and time, where words mutate and meanings shift. Writing creates fixity. It preserves language. It makes possible the transmission of thought across the barrier of the language divide. It allows a speaker of one language to learn the written forms of another, to bridge what the Babel myth portrayed as an unbridgeable gap. The invention of writing in Mesopotamia was thus a peculiar reversal of the Babel narrative. Rather than language being split and communication becoming impossible, the Sumerians developed a technology that transcended the limitations of spoken language itself. Their clay tablets, inscribed with cuneiform marks, travelled across vast distances. Traders and scribes learned to read and write Sumerian, allowing communication between speakers of different tongues. Later, writing systems would be adapted to record other languages: Akkadian, Hittite, Aramaic, each inscribed in borrowed cuneiform or novel scripts. The very technology that emerged in the shadow of Babel became humanity's method for overcoming linguistic division. In a profound sense, the Sumerians answered the curse of confused languages with the blessing of written language, creating a form of communication that transcended the ephemeral, ever-changing medium of speech. What emerges from the scientific study of language diversity is not a picture of punishment and confusion, but rather one of remarkable human adaptability and innovation. The 7,000 languages spoken today represent not a curse, but a stunning testament to the creativity and diversity of human culture. Each language embodies a unique way of conceptualizing reality, a distinct set of grammatical possibilities, a vocabulary shaped by the environment and history of its speakers, a language that makes distinctions between objects that move and objects that don't, or that marks grammatically whether the speaker witnessed an event or merely heard about it, or that possesses different words for different types of ocean. Such a language is not a broken version of English or Mandarin. It is a complete, functional, and often elegant solution to the problem of human communication, shaped by the particular needs and circumstances of its speakers. To lose a language is to lose not merely a communication system, but an entire way of conceptualizing and organizing human experience. The history of languages, viewed through the lens of science, reveals patterns that transcend the boundaries of any single cultural narrative. Yes, humanity's languages have diverse origins, scattered among multiple ancestral language families. Yes, the deep past becomes clouded as we peer backward through the millennia, and the ultimate origin of all human language remains shrouded in uncertainty. Yet this uncertainty is not a failure of science, but rather a feature of the historical process itself. Languages evolve, diverge, and transform through mechanisms as natural and understandable as those governing biological evolution. The appearance of confusion and multiplicity, which so troubled the architects of Babel in the ancient story, is revealed through modern linguistics to be the inevitable outcome of human populations spreading across the globe, adapting to new environments and continuing to speak, to evolve their speech, to reshape the very tools through which they communicate. Where myth saw divine punishment, science reveals the slow, patient, awe-inspiring process through which human culture itself evolves. And where myth emphasized division, the evidence of language families and linguistic archaeology suggests not an absolute break, but rather a continuous thread running backward through time, connecting all human languages to deep and common sources, sources that recede into antiquity, growing ever more distant, ever more difficult to trace, yet seemingly present in the very structure of how we speak. The Tower of Babel stands as one of history's most enduring myths, yet its reach extends far beyond the ancient Near East. Across continents and centuries, cultures separated by vast distances and unable to communicate with one another have told strikingly similar stories, tales of humans building impossibly tall structures, reaching toward the heavens, and facing divine punishment for their audacity. These parallel myths suggest something profound about human nature itself, about our eternal desire to transcend our limitations and commune with the divine, and about the fear that such ambition might provoke consequences we cannot foresee. As we explore these echoing narratives from around the world, we begin to see the Tower of Babel not as an isolated biblical account, but as a reflection of a universal human yearning, one that appears again and again in the mythological consciousness of our species. Long before the Hebrew scribes recorded the Tower of Babel in the pages of Genesis, the ancient Sumerians had already committed their own version of a linguistic catastrophe to clay tablets. The story of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, preserved in Sumerian literature and dating back to at least the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, tells of a time when all people spoke one language and understood one another perfectly. Enmerkar, the great king of the Sumerian city-state of Uruk, sought to dominate the distant land of Aratta, which lay in the mountains far to the east. He sent a messenger to the Lord of Aratta with a demanding ultimatum, expecting easy compliance. But the messenger found himself unable to deliver the message, not because of resistance from the Lord of Aratta, but because something far stranger had occurred. The clarity of language that had once united all humanity had fractured. The messenger could not make himself understood. The words that fell from his lips seemed to confuse rather than clarify. In that moment, according to this ancient Sumerian account, human language became confused and multiplied. People could no longer comprehend one another. The story offers no explicit explanation for why this happened, no mention of a divine tower or human arrogance. Yet the core narrative remains eerily familiar to those who know the biblical account. The sudden confusion of tongues, the inability to communicate across what had previously been transparent understanding, the sense that something fundamental in human civilization had been broken. These elements appear in both traditions, separated by centuries and cultural boundaries. This Sumerian precedent raises fascinating questions about how myths travel and transform across time and culture. Did the Hebrew scribes encounter the Sumerian account and reshape it for their own theological purposes? Did both peoples draw from an even earlier Mesopotamian source? Or does the appearance of such similar narratives in different places suggest something deeper? That certain fundamental anxieties about human ambition and divine response recur naturally in the mythological imagination. The Sumerian story, like its biblical counterpart, speaks to the fragility of human unity and the way that understanding can shatter in an instant. It reminds us that in the ancient world, the inability to communicate was not merely an inconvenience, but a fundamental threat to civilization itself. Without shared language, empires could not be built, trade could not flourish, and the basic bonds that held societies together would dissolve. The echoes of the Tower of Babel extend far beyond the ancient Near East, reaching across the Atlantic to the great civilizations of Mesoamerica. In the region that would become Mexico, the Toltec people preserved a legend of their own great tower, a structure so tall and magnificent that it seemed to touch the clouds themselves. According to Toltec mythology, this tower was built by the ancestors in an age of extraordinary human achievement, when the people possessed knowledge and power that would later be lost. The tower stood as a testament to human ingenuity and ambition, a monument to what mortals could accomplish when they worked together. But like the Tower of Babel, this Mexican tower did not remain standing. It fell. The destruction came as punishment, the mythology suggests, for the people's overreach and their forgetting of proper reverence toward the divine. The great tower crumbled and the people scattered, their unified civilization fragmenting into smaller groups and separate nations. The Cholula Pyramid, which still stands in Mexico today as one of the largest structures in the world by volume, has been connected by some scholars and local traditions to this Toltec legend. Whether or not the Cholula Pyramid was explicitly built as a tower to heaven, it represents the same impulse, the human desire to build something so immense, so magnificent, that it would stand as a permanent challenge to the sky itself. The structure, constructed over many centuries and reaching toward the heavens in a series of ascending platforms, embodies the same ambition that drove the biblical Tower of Babel. The parallel between the Mesoamerican and Mesopotamian accounts is striking, particularly given that the two civilizations had no known contact with one another. Neither could have influenced the other through trade routes or cultural exchange. Yet both independently generated myths about a great tower, about human ambition reaching too far, and about the consequences that followed. In the African continent, numerous cultures preserved their own variations on this timeless theme. From the traditions of the Bantu peoples to the mythologies of West African kingdoms, stories emerge of humans attempting to build towers or climb toward the heavens, only to face divine intervention and punishment. In some accounts, a great tower reaches so high that it threatens to disturb the gods in their celestial realm. In others, humans attempt to create a ladder or bridge to heaven itself, seeking to cross the boundary between the mortal and divine worlds. These efforts invariably provoke a response from the divine powers. The structure collapses, the people scatter. Humanity is divided and dispersed across the land. While the specifics vary from culture to culture, the fundamental pattern remains consistent. Human ambition provokes divine response, unity shatters into division, and the world is forever changed by the consequences of overreach. These African traditions remind us that the Tower of Babel narrative is not exotic or culturally peculiar, but rather emerges from a deep well of shared human experience and concern. Every civilization that has risen to a certain level of complexity has contemplated the question of limits, both the limits of human power and the limits that the divine or the natural order might place upon human ambition. The tower myths from Africa suggest that this anxiety about overreach and its consequences is not confined to the monotheistic traditions of the Near East, but runs through the mythological consciousness of cultures across the globe. In the Hindu and Buddhist traditions of South and East Asia, the concept of the cosmic mountain plays a role analogous to the tower in Western mythologies. Mount Meru, also known as Sumeru, stands at the center of the universe in both Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. This is not a tower built by human hands, yet it represents the same yearning, the desire to reach toward the divine, to ascend from the realm of the earthly toward the realm of the transcendent. Mount Meru is traditionally depicted as the seat of the gods, the axis mundi around which all of creation revolves. In Hindu mythology, the gods and demons once churned the cosmic ocean together in an effort to achieve immortality. They used Mount Meru as a pivot point for their cosmic labor, wrapping a great serpent around the mountain and pulling it back and forth to churn the waters of creation itself. This vision of a cosmic mountain at the center of existence reflects a similar aspiration to connect the earthly and divine realms, though expressed through different mythological language and imagery. The Buddhist tradition similarly reveres Mount Meru as the center of the Buddhist cosmos, the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, and from which the Buddha's teachings radiate outward to all sentient beings. The mountain becomes, in this context, not primarily a monument to human ambition, but rather a symbol of spiritual ascent and the attainment of transcendence. Yet the underlying impulse remains consistent. The human imagination projects an impossibly tall and sacred structure at the center of the cosmos, a place where the boundaries between the earthly and divine, between the mortal and eternal, become thin and permeable. Whether we encounter this image in the form of a tower built by human hands or a cosmic mountain at the center of existence, we see the same fundamental human yearning expressed through different cultural and religious frameworks. What these parallel myths across the globe suggest when we consider them together is something profound about universal human psychology. The desire to transcend our limitations, to reach towards something greater than ourselves, to build something so magnificent and lasting that it will endure forever. These impulses appear to be hardwired into human consciousness. They emerge independently in cultures separated by oceans and mountains, in peoples who had no knowledge of one another's existence. This suggests that the myths are not arbitrary cultural inventions, but rather expressions of deep psychological and spiritual truths that resonate across humanity. Yet paired with this desire for transcendence comes an equally universal anxiety, the fear that such ambition might transgress boundaries that ought not to be crossed, that overreach invokes consequences, that there are limits beyond which mortals ought not venture. Every culture that tells a tower myth tells it as a cautionary tale. The tower does not stand forever, the builders do not achieve their goal. Something intervenes, divine punishment, natural catastrophe, or the simple operation of cosmic law, and the ambitious structure falls. This too reflects something universal in human experience. We all know on some level that our reach has limits, that we are subject to forces larger than ourselves, that the universe operates according to principles we do not fully understand or control. The tower myths give form and narrative to these intuitions. They tell us that ambition is human and natural, but that unchecked ambition that forgets its place in the order of things, carries dangers with it. Now, having explored these parallel myths from around the world, we turn our attention to what happened to Babylon itself, the great city that, according to the biblical account, housed the Tower of Babel. Babylon did not remain eternal. The magnificent civilization that had endured for centuries, that had produced some of humanity's greatest achievements in mathematics, astronomy, law, and architecture, eventually fell. The city that seemed so invulnerable, so thoroughly established in the landscape of human civilization, would gradually decline and fade from prominence. The decisive blow came in 539 before the Common Era, when Cyrus the Great, king of the emerging Persian Empire, conquered Babylon. Cyrus commanded one of the great military powers of the ancient world, and he had set his sights on consolidating the fragmented kingdoms of the Near East under Persian rule. Babylon, for all its former glory, could not resist. The city fell to the Persian forces, and with that conquest, Babylon's independence ended. What is striking is that Cyrus, despite his conquest, treated Babylon with relative respect. He did not destroy the city outright. He allowed its people to maintain many of their religious and cultural practices. He even presented himself as a restorer of Babylonian traditions, rather than as a conqueror bent on obliteration. Yet the political reality was clear. Babylon was no longer the centre of a great empire. It had become a provincial city within the larger Persian realm. The age of Babylonian dominance had ended. Centuries later, another great conqueror would visit the ruins of Babylon. A man whose ambitions seemed to echo those of the tower builders themselves. Alexander the Great, as he swept through the Near East conquering everything in his path, arrived in Babylon in 331 before the Common Era. By that time, nearly 2 centuries had passed since the Persian conquest, and Babylon had continued its slow decline. The great structures of the city were still standing, but they were aging. The Tower of Babel, or at least the ruins of what remained of it, was still visible. Alexander, that brilliant military strategist and student of Greek philosophy, looked upon the ruins and conceived of a grand ambition. He would rebuild the Tower of Babel. He would restore Babylon to its former glory. He would make it the capital of his vast new empire, rivaling anything the ancients had created. Alexander commanded that work begin on the reconstruction of the tower. Labourers gathered, plans were drawn. The project commenced with the same optimistic energy that had animated the original builders millennia earlier. Yet the universe, it seems, had other plans. Before the work could progress very far, before the tower could rise again toward the heavens, Alexander himself fell ill. He was only 32 years old. His death came swiftly and unexpectedly, leaving his empire in chaos and his grand plans unfulfilled. The Tower of Babylon would not be rebuilt. The great conqueror who had seemed, like the ancient Babylonians before him, possessed of the power to reshape the world to his vision, discovered the same limits that all mortals must eventually confront. His ambitions, no matter how great, could not overcome the fragility of the human body or the uncertainty of fate. It is almost as if the universe was replaying, for this arrogant young conqueror, the same lesson that the original tower had been meant to teach, that human power has limits, that the grandest ambitions can be thwarted by forces beyond our control, that even the most extraordinary individuals must ultimately bow to the constraints of mortality. Following Alexander's death and the subsequent division of his empire, Babylon continued its slow decline. The city that had been the intellectual and political centre of the ancient world gradually faded into obscurity. Empires rose and fell around it. New cities became the centres of power and commerce. Trade routes shifted. The great city that had seemed so eternal, so firmly established in human civilization, was slowly swallowed by time itself. The sand gradually crept across the streets and plazas that had once teemed with merchants and scholars. The great walls that had seemed impregnable crumbled piece by piece. The temples that had housed the gods fell into disrepair. The houses where people had lived their daily lives were buried beneath accumulating layers of dust and debris. What had once been a thriving metropolis became a collection of ruins, partially excavated, partially buried, slowly disappearing back into the landscape from which it had emerged. The disappearance of Babylon is particularly poignant when we consider the Tower of Babel and the mythology surrounding it. The tower was built as a monument to human permanence, to the idea that mortals could create something so magnificent and substantial that it would endure forever, that would stand as a testament to human achievement and power. Yet the tower fell. The city that housed it was conquered and gradually abandoned. The entire civilization that had built these wonders was swallowed by history. The ambition to create something lasting was ultimately thwarted by the very forces that all mortal creations must eventually confront. The passage of time, the shifting of the earth, the relentless advance of natural processes that slowly bury and dissolve all human works. If you have found the Calm Archive to be a soothing companion during your bedtime hours, I would be deeply grateful if you would share this video with someone in your life who might benefit from it tonight. Perhaps someone you know struggles with sleep, or perhaps there is simply someone who would appreciate the story and the calm voice guiding them toward rest. Sharing this video might become a gift of tranquility to them, and if you have not yet subscribed to the Calm Archive, I encourage you to do so now. Subscribe and you will receive these stories regularly, a consistent presence in your evenings, a reliable companion as you prepare your mind and body for sleep. The subscribe button awaits your click. Now, where were we? Yes, in the ancient city of Babylon, watching as the great tower crumbled and the sand began its patient work of reclaiming what human ambition had built. Let us rest in this image for a moment, contemplating the impermanence of all mortal works and the way that even the grandest achievements of humanity eventually return to dust. As the 19th century drew to a close, European archaeologists began to turn their attention toward the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, driven by a hunger to uncover the physical remnants of civilizations that had existed thousands of years before their own time. The very name Babylon had captured the imagination of scholars for centuries, but it remained largely a phantom, a place known through ancient texts and biblical references, rather than through the tangible evidence of excavation. The great city that had dominated the Mesopotamian world, that had produced the Code of Hammurabi and stood as a beacon of human achievement, lay buried beneath centuries of accumulated sand and rubble, waiting to be rediscovered by those patient enough to dig. It was in this atmosphere of scholarly curiosity and imperial ambition that a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey arrived in Iraq in 1899, carrying with him the tools, determination and vision that would transform our understanding of Babylon from legend into historical reality. Koldewey's excavations would continue for 18 years, from 1899 until the outbreak of World War I forced him to abandon his work in 1917, making his campaign one of the longest and most systematic archaeological efforts ever undertaken in Mesopotamia at that time. He brought with him a methodical approach that was revolutionary for its era. Rather than simply digging for spectacular artifacts to display in European museums, he sought to understand the layout of the entire city, to trace the paths of its streets, to identify the locations of its temples and palaces, and to reconstruct the lived experience of those who had walked those same streets thousands of years ago. His teams worked with painstaking care, documenting everything they found, drawing detailed maps, and preserving thousands of fragments that less careful excavators might have discarded. The German excavations established the first comprehensive picture of Babylon's physical geography, revealing the locations of the Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue glazed brick decorations, the processional way that had been used for religious ceremonies, the remains of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and countless other structures that had once formed the architectural fabric of this great city. When Koldewey's team directed their efforts toward the location where historical texts suggested the tower should stand, they encountered what must have seemed at first a profound disappointment. Not a soaring structure of brick and stone, but rather a depressed area in the ground, a hollow that had once been the foundation and lower portions of an enormous edifice. What they discovered was that the Tower of Babylon, the Etemenanki, had been constructed in such a way that much of its mass was built downward as well as upward, with deep foundations and underground chambers that would have supported the immense weight of the structure above. Over the centuries, as the tower fell into disrepair and the surrounding city was abandoned, the upper portions had crumbled and been carried away by wind and rain, leaving behind this distinctive depression, essentially a water-filled scar in the landscape that marked where something tremendous had once stood. The depression measured approximately 90 meters on each side, suggesting that the tower's base had been roughly square in shape, and the presence of brick fragments and architectural debris confirmed that this was indeed the location of Babylon's most famous monument. What had once reached toward the heavens was now nothing more than a void, a negative space where positive mass had once existed, a powerful reminder of the way that time erodes even the greatest human achievements. The physical evidence that Koldewey's team could recover was limited by the very nature of the tower's destruction and the passage of millennia. Yet the clay tablets they discovered throughout Babylon provided a kind of written archaeology that was in many ways more valuable than stone and brick. Thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets emerged from the excavations, many of them administrative documents that recorded the daily functioning of the city, lists of workers, inventories of goods, contracts between merchants, records of temple expenditures. These tablets, when painstakingly translated by scholars over many decades, transformed Babylon from a legendary city into a concrete historical reality, a place where actual people conducted actual business, paid taxes, conducted lawsuits, and recorded the events of their lives in wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay. Among these thousands of documents were some that would prove to have extraordinary significance, not just for our understanding of Babylon itself, but for our understanding of the Bible and the history of human religion and literature. One of the most extraordinary moments in 19th century scholarship came when a scholar named George Smith, working at the British Museum in 1872, was examining tablets from the library of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria when he suddenly recognized something astonishing: a Mesopotamian flood narrative that bore unmistakable similarities to the story of Noah's flood as recorded in the Book of Genesis. Smith's hands must have trembled as he read the words describing a great deluge sent by the gods to destroy humanity, a divine command to build a vessel to survive the waters, the loading of animals into that vessel, and the eventual grounding of the boat on a mountain as the waters receded. The implications were staggering. This story had been written down in cuneiform more than 1,000 years before the Book of Genesis was compiled in its final form. The discovery suggested that the biblical account, rather than being an entirely unique revelation, had roots in the much older literary traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. Smith's discovery was met with both fascination and resistance. Some scholars embraced it as evidence of cultural borrowing and transmission of narratives across ancient civilizations, while others saw it as somehow diminishing the authority or uniqueness of the biblical text. The flood tablet was only the beginning, however, of a much larger reorientation in biblical scholarship that would result from the excavation and decipherment of Mesopotamian texts. As more and more tablets were discovered and translated, scholars began to recognize that numerous biblical narratives had Mesopotamian precedents, or parallels, creation myths, stories of great kings, descriptions of temples and religious practices, even the structure of legal codes. The Code of Hammurabi, dating back to the 18th century before the Common Era, contained laws that resembled in form and sometimes in content the laws recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. The story of how the god Enuma created the world and defeated the chaos monster Tiamat bore similarities to creation accounts in the Bible. The Mesopotamian flood stories existed in multiple versions, passed down through different cultures and time periods, suggesting a widespread cultural narrative that had eventually been incorporated into the biblical tradition. This realization did not mean, in the view of most scholars, that the biblical text was simply plagiarized from Mesopotamian sources. Rather, it suggested a much more complex process of cultural transmission, adaptation, and reinterpretation as ideas moved from one civilization to another and from one historical period to the next. The discovery that the Bible had roots in Mesopotamian traditions was neither shocking to ancient historians, who were already aware of the extensive cultural contacts between these regions, nor was it necessarily threatening to believers in the spiritual truth of the biblical narratives. It simply meant that understanding the Bible required understanding it within the context of the broader ancient world. Among the most remarkable archaeological discoveries related to Babylon and the Tower was a stone tablet, sometimes called the Babel stele, that was discovered in the early 20th century and has become an increasingly important source of information in recent decades as scholars have applied new analytical techniques to its study. This stone monument, created during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before the Common Era, depicts the great king standing beside what can only be identified as the Tower of Babylon, shown in profile with clearly visible tiers or levels marked in relief. The 7-tiered structure is unmistakably represented, with architectural details rendered in stone, and the entire composition suggests that this was an important monument meant to commemorate Nebuchadnezzar's role in maintaining or completing the tower, suggesting that the king himself considered the tower one of his greatest achievements, worthy of being recorded in stone for posterity. The stele also contains cuneiform inscriptions that provide additional information about the tower and its construction, making it an invaluable source of both visual and textual information about this monument that had otherwise left relatively little physical evidence of its appearance and dimensions. Scholars studying the stele have noted the careful way the tower is depicted, the attention to detail in showing its multiple tiers, and the positioning of the king as if to claim credit for this magnificent structure. suggesting that the image was meant to project power and divine favour to anyone who encountered it. The application of modern technology to the study of ancient Babylon has revealed details that would have been impossible to discover through conventional excavation alone. Satellite imagery, when examined with careful attention to variations in soil colour and ground elevation, has allowed archaeologists to trace the outlines of streets, identify the locations of buildings, and map the extent of the ancient city with a precision that was unimaginable in Koldewey's era. These images show that ancient Babylon was an enormously extensive city, spreading across many square kilometres of the Mesopotamian plain, with neighbourhoods, temples, administrative buildings, and residential areas arranged in a complex urban pattern that speaks to the city's importance and the sophistication of its planning. The satellite imagery has also allowed researchers to identify features that had already been buried again since Koldewey's excavations, as desert winds and periodic flooding have continued their slow work of covering and uncovering the artefacts of the past. The comparison between what was visible in Koldewey's time and what the satellite imagery shows today reveals how quickly the desert reclaims what humans have exposed, how fragile the preservation of archaeological sites can be, and how important it is to document and protect these places for future generations. The history of Babylon's rediscovery and study took a dramatic and tragic turn in the early years of the 21st century, when the United States military invasion of Iraq in 2003 brought military forces to the region where the ancient city lay. In the years following the invasion, military bases were constructed on or adjacent to the archaeological site of Babylon, with heavy equipment and armoured vehicles driven directly over areas that contained irreplaceable artefacts and structures from the ancient world. Reports from archaeologists and preservation organisations documented the damage that resulted. Compacted soil that had been carefully excavated and documented, the disturbance of archaeological layers that had taken centuries to accumulate, and the removal or loss of artefacts that would never be recovered. The presence of military forces meant that archaeological work had to be suspended, that documentation of the site could not continue, and that the ongoing degradation of the site through both military activity and the natural processes of weathering and decay could not be monitored or mitigated. The damage to Babylon during this period stands as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of archaeological sites to the disruptions caused by warfare and military occupation, and of the way that human conflicts can destroy the physical record of human history. The aftermath of military occupation has left deep scars on the landscape of Babylon, but it has also spurred international efforts to document, preserve, and protect what remains of this remarkable ancient city. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, has been engaged in efforts to secure the site, to prevent further deterioration, and to plan for future conservation and restoration work. These efforts have included the creation of protective barriers around the most vulnerable areas, the training of local Iraqi archaeologists and heritage professionals who can continue the work of documentation and preservation, and the development of comprehensive documentation of the site, using modern digital technologies that create three-dimensional models and detailed records of what exists today. The recognition that Babylon is a World Heritage Site, a place of such extraordinary historical and cultural importance that it belongs not just to Iraq but to all of humanity, has given these preservation efforts an international dimension, and has mobilized resources and expertise from around the world. Modern efforts to understand and preserve Babylon have also included the creation of the Babylon Museum, a facility designed to house and display artifacts from the site, and to provide visitors with an interpretation of Babylon's history and significance. The museum represents an attempt to create a space where the physical remains of the ancient city, the clay tablets, the ceramic vessels, the brick fragments inscribed with cuneiform text, can be studied, preserved, and presented to the public in ways that illuminate the sophistication and importance of Mesopotamian civilization. The presence of such a museum at the site itself means that future visitors will be able to stand in the very location where the tower once stood, to handle or examine actual artifacts from Babylon's past, and to gain a visceral sense of connection to the people who lived in this ancient city. The museum also serves as a centre for ongoing research and scholarship, where new discoveries can be studied and analysed, where new conservation techniques can be developed and tested, and where the work of understanding Babylon can continue, despite the challenges posed by the site's location in a region that has experienced profound historical disruptions. The rediscovery and ongoing study of Babylon has fundamentally transformed our understanding not just of ancient Mesopotamia, but of the ancient world more broadly, and of the relationship between different ancient cultures and civilizations. The excavations that began with Koldewey's patient digging revealed that Babylon was not a legendary phantom, but a real city, with real streets and buildings, real people who conducted real business, real kings who made real decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The clay tablets discovered in Babylon and other Mesopotamian sites showed that writing, the technology that allows humans to preserve knowledge and ideas across generations, had developed in this region thousands of years before many people had realized, and that the written traditions of later civilizations, including the biblical traditions of ancient Israel, had been influenced by and borrowed from the literary and intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. The archaeological remains of the tower itself, though modest in their appearance today, essentially a depression filled with water and rubble, stand as tangible evidence that something extraordinary had once existed in this location, something grand enough to inspire biblical narratives and to be remembered across millennia. The ongoing work of preservation and study suggests that, even after more than a century of excavation, after the damage of warfare and neglect, Babylon still has secrets to reveal, still has knowledge to impart to those patient and careful enough to listen to what the earth and its buried artifacts have to say. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, I want to invite you to consider something that has puzzled and fascinated humanity for thousands of years. Not just the Tower of Babel itself, but what the story of the tower really means, what it reveals about us, about the endless human reaching that defines our species. Because somewhere in the silence of this ancient tale lies something profound about who we are, what we want, and why we want it so desperately. The tower was built, you remember, by people who shared one language, one vision, one dream of transcendence. A dream so unified, so powerful, that they believed together they could touch the sky itself. But the story has never really been about a single structure of brick and stone and bitumen. It has always been about something deeper, something that lives in the human heart across every generation, every civilization, every moment in history where we have felt that irresistible urge to build, to reach, to exceed what we thought possible. Consider for a moment the universal human desire that pulses through every culture and every time, the desire to build. From the moment our ancestors first stacked stone upon stone, we have been architects of our own transcendence. We build homes to shelter ourselves from the darkness, temples to reach toward the divine, cities to gather and create meaning together. And in all of this building, there is something almost sacred, a kind of defiance, a refusal to accept the limits we are born with. We are not content to live as other animals do, moving through the world as it is given to us. No, we reshape it. We transform it. We stand back and ask, what if? And then we spend generations making that what if into reality. The Tower of Babel speaks to this part of us with an honesty that few stories possess. It does not condemn the desire to build, it honors it. The ambition itself is not presented as sinful or foolish. What the story explores instead is something far more subtle and far more true to the human experience. The tension between our ambitions and our humility, between our reach and our grasp, between what we dream of becoming and what we actually are. Every great civilization has felt this tension ripple through its heart. The medieval Christians who heard the Babel story saw in it a warning against pride, yet they continued building their cathedrals higher and higher, creating spires that scraped the sky, because they understood something important, that the drive to build, to create, to reach towards something greater than ourselves is not something we can simply turn off. It is woven into the fabric of who we are. They built their towers not despite the story of Babel, but in conversation with it, in a careful negotiation between ambition and humility, between reaching upward and remembering our place in the cosmos. And this negotiation, this delicate balance, has continued through every age. The Renaissance architects who designed domes that had never been built before, the industrial engineers who created structures of steel that seemed to defy gravity itself, the explorers who looked at their maps and said, "What lies beyond the edge?" All of them were having their own conversation with the Babel story, whether they knew it or not. The human desire to transcend our limitations has never dimmed. If anything, it has grown more intense, more sophisticated, more woven into the very fabric of how we understand ourselves. Think of the great towers of the modern world, those gleaming skyscrapers that rise from our cities, like monuments to human persistence and human ambition. When you stand beneath one of these structures, when you crane your neck back and watch it climb toward the clouds, you are feeling something that those ancient builders on the plain of Shinar felt as well. You are part of a chain of reaching that spans millennia. Would touch the sky. And we have not would touch the sky, and we have not stopped reaching. We have only found new ways to do it. The space programs that send rockets toward the stars. These are Babel retold in the language of the 21st century. The engineers and scientists who pour their lives into reaching toward other planets, who dream of establishing human settlements on Mars, who look at the cosmos and refuse to accept that we must remain bound to this small blue world. They are the modern builders of Babel. They feel the same pull, the same irresistible reaching upward, the same refusal to be satisfied with what we already have. And then there is the internet, perhaps the most interesting modern Babel of all, because the original tower was built by a people with one language, one understanding, one unified vision. But the internet is something different. It is a Babel in the truest sense, a space where thousands of languages converge, where people separated by vast distances and incompatible worldviews attempt to communicate, to build understanding together, to create something that transcends the boundaries of individual nations and cultures. It is Babel rebuilt, but this time we have learned something. We have learned that unity of language is not the same as unity of purpose. We have learned that we can reach toward the heavens even when we cannot agree on every detail of how we get there. And now we stand at the threshold of artificial intelligence, at the boundary between what human beings have created and what we have learned to create. AI is perhaps the modern Babel in its purest form, the ultimate expression of the human desire to build something that surpasses us, something that might think more quickly than we do, understand more deeply than we can, reach toward truths that have always eluded our human grasp. It is Babel rebuilt with ones and zeros, with algorithms and neural networks, with the same dangerous beauty that drove those ancient builders to stack their bricks higher and higher. And as you lie there listening to these words, perhaps drifting slightly now into that comfortable space between waking and sleeping, I want you to sit with something that might seem paradoxical. When the tower was finished, when it reached its full height and stood as a monument to human unified effort, what happened? The languages were scattered. The people could no longer understand one another. They were separated, dispersed, sent to the corners of the earth. And yes, we have interpreted this for thousands of years as a punishment, as a consequence of human pride, as God's judgment on those who reach too high. But what if we have been missing something? What if the scattering was not a punishment at all, but a gift? Think about the world that resulted from that scattering. Think about the extraordinary diversity of languages, thousands upon thousands of them, each one carrying its own unique way of seeing the world, its own philosophy, its own poetry, its own irreplaceable perspective on what it means to be human. The Inuit language has dozens of words for different types of snow, each one capturing a subtle variation that speakers of other languages struggle to perceive. Indigenous languages of the Amazon contain sophisticated understandings of plant medicine and ecological relationships that Western science is only now beginning to appreciate. The languages of the Pacific Islands encode navigation techniques and astronomical knowledge in their grammatical structures. Every language that has ever been spoken is a unique and irreplaceable way of being in the world. Every single one is a different path toward understanding what it means to exist. And all of this extraordinary diversity came from the scattering. If the Tower of Babel had never happened, if humanity had continued speaking one unified language, what would we have lost? We would have gained efficiency, yes. We would have eliminated the friction of misunderstanding. We would have created a world where communication was simpler, where borders were less meaningful, where we could coordinate our efforts more effectively. But we would have sacrificed something incalculable. We would have lost the creative tension that comes from difference. We would have lost the way that struggling to understand someone from a different culture, someone whose language encodes different values and different ways of seeing, actually expands our consciousness. We would have lost the beautiful conflict and compromise that comes from true diversity. The history of human civilization is actually a story of how diversity makes us stronger. It is the mixing of cultures, the collision of perspectives, the efforts of people with different languages and different worldviews to understand one another that has produced our greatest achievements. The Renaissance was a moment of extraordinary creative energy because it brought together artists and thinkers from across Europe. People with different training and different traditions, forced by circumstance and commerce to collaborate. Modern science progresses most rapidly when researchers from different cultures and educational backgrounds bring their different ways of thinking to bear on the same problems. The art that moves us most deeply often comes from artists who have lived between two cultures, who speak multiple languages, who carry within themselves the beautiful tension of difference. And so perhaps the Tower of Babel story has been trying to tell us something all along. Not that reaching is wrong, but that reaching alone, in isolation, with a single, unified vision imposed on everyone leads to catastrophe. The gift of the scattering is not that we are separated, but that we are diverse. And diversity, while it makes communication harder, while it introduces friction and misunderstanding, is actually the source of our greatest strength. It is the mechanism by which human civilization learns and grows and transcends its previous limitations. Every generation has seen itself in the Babel story, and every generation has understood it slightly differently, which perhaps suggests that the story itself is deep enough to contain truths that shift depending on who is listening. Medieval Christians saw a warning against pride. The Enlightenment thinkers saw a moment when humanity had been forced into intellectual isolation that they were now overcoming. Modern Silicon Valley entrepreneurs see the internet as a way to reunite humanity, to eliminate the barriers to understanding that were imposed at Babel. Climate scientists see the scattering as a warning about what happens when humanity loses the ability to coordinate global action. And perhaps all of these interpretations are true. Perhaps the Tower of Babel is not a story with a single meaning, but rather a mirror that each of us looks into and sees something different reflected back. Tonight, as you rest here in the darkness, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine the plain of Shinar not as it was, with the tower rising high against the daylight sky, but as it is now, in the deep night thousands of years later. The tower is long gone. It has crumbled into dust and been buried beneath the earth, its stones scattered and repurposed into other structures. But if you could stand there at night, if you could feel the cool breeze moving across that ancient plain, you would see the stars. You would see them the way those ancient builders saw them, the way every generation before and after has seen them, brilliant and eternal and impossibly distant, burning in the darkness with a light that has travelled countless years to reach your eyes. And you would feel something in that moment, a particular kind of peace that comes from understanding that all our reaching, all our building, all our desperate ambition and creativity and effort to transcend our limitations, all of it is beautiful and temporary and ultimately insignificant in the face of the vast cosmos that surrounds us. The story of the Tower of Babel was never really about the tower at all. It was about us. It was about the paradoxical nature of being human, capable of such extraordinary things, yet limited in ways we can never fully overcome, able to dream of touching the heavens yet bound to the earth, able to create unity and vision and grand plans, yet forever struggling with the fact that different people see the world in different ways. The tower fell, the languages scattered, the people wandered to the corners of the earth, but the story survived. And tonight, thousands of years later, you heard it. You carried it one more generation forward. You were part of the great chain of memory that stretches back to the very beginning of human consciousness. And you have received this ancient story, and you will pass it on, perhaps to someone you love, perhaps simply by carrying it within your own mind and heart. That is the miracle of memory. That is the gift of language, that despite our separation, despite our inability to fully understand one another, we are still connected through stories, through the words that travel from one mouth to another, from one generation to the next, carrying meaning and warmth and the accumulated wisdom of all those who came before. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this helped you relax tonight, subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload regularly and there's always something new to drift off to. Tell me in the comments. If you could visit ancient Babylon for one day, what would you want to see first? As you sink deeper into your pillow now, as your breathing becomes slower and more peaceful, as your muscles relax and your mind begins to drift towards sleep, I want you to feel the comfort of that connection. You're not alone in your wandering, in your reaching, in your ambitions and your fears. You are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Rest now. Rest with the knowledge that the reaching continues, and the scattering continues, and the connecting across difference continues, and all of it is exactly as it should be. Sleep now, knowing that you are held within a story that has been told and retold for thousands of years. A story that will continue to be told long after you're gone, a story about us, about all of us, about what it means to reach and what it means to be human. The Calm Archive rests with you tonight.